Psychologists talk about projection and transference, by which we project our fears outward to another person or object and then react to them. Maybe Seth means a symbolic creation, I said. But soon the words started coming again, and it became obvious that Seth was insisting upon a literal materialization. Who left the room first, Jane and I, or the images? Rob asked. Again, I was speaking for Seth. The projected fragments disappeared. They stood up, walked across the floor, and disappeared in the crowd. They had no power to leave the place where they were born unless you gave it to them. Remember that they did exist. By the same token, your triumph reinforced the healthy aspects of your present egos. The evening grew late, but Seth showed no signs of wearing out. Just before midnight, Rob and I took another rest period and decided to end the session. It was Seth, incidentally, who suggested we take a 5 to 10 minute break every half hour or so. Rob and I didn't know what to make of this session. It was the first time I'd spoken for so long at a time, for one thing. For another, we didn't know how to evaluate what was said. Seth's explanations of the York Beach affair made intuitive sense to us. Certainly something significant had happened that night, but had we actually materialized the physical images of our hidden fears? Do people do this often? If so, the implications were staggering. Or was the explanation psychologically and symbolically valid, but practically a lot of nonsense? Should we continue with the sessions? I was somewhat more reluctant than Rob, being so directly involved. But what an opportunity, I thought. We decided to hold at least a few more sessions to see what might develop. Rob had some questions about fragment personalities he wanted to ask. What did Seth mean when he said we could have turned into those images? Rob wrote the questions down so he wouldn't forget them, and 2 nights later, we sat down at the board once more. At this point, of course, we had no idea whether or not each session would be our last, regardless of our conscious decisions. For all we knew, Seth might vanish as Frank Withers had. Rob had his list of questions ready so we could get some answers while we still had the opportunity. But in this next session, I spoke for Seth for a longer time than I had before. Seth gave us a detailed account of 2 past lives and began a reincarnational history of Rob's family. The material contained some excellent psychological insights. Using them, we found ourselves getting along much better with our relatives. But I didn't like this insistence upon reincarnation at all. The psychological insights are great, I said to Rob at break, but the reincarnational part is probably fantasy. Delightful, but fantasy. You don't have to make your mind up one way or the other tonight, do you? Rob asked. What's the rush? See what else he has to say. Besides, I've learned as much about my family tonight as I have all my life. That's worth something. Then, when the session resumed, Rob asked the question that had been on our minds since Seth first mentioned the York Beach images. If Jane and I had subconsciously accepted those images, would we have been able to return home where we're known? The images were older. Instantly, the words tumbled through my head and out my mouth. I was out, and Seth was on. The images represented a culmination of many years' experience of a negative trend. If you had accepted them, you would have ended up as replicas as you transferred into the images. Yet, what creativity and constructiveness you possessed would have softened the faces. You would be recognizable to friends, but changes would be noted. The remark would be made that perhaps you didn't seem the same, and with good reason. Have either of us had other similar experiences? Rob asked. There was an afternoon in a small park when you were a child, about 11. You thought you were alone. was close to 5, September 17th, on a day when there was no school. Another boy appeared. You had not seen him approach, and took it for granted that he came by way of a walk that wound around a bandstand. He had jacks in his hand. You looked at each other and were about to speak, but a squirrel ran up a nearby tree. You turned to watch, and when you turned back, the boy was gone. For a short time you wondered, and then the incident was forgotten. As a matter of fact, at the same time, your brother, Lauren, was looking out the window of your father's shop across the way, and saw nothing. Was the boy real or what? Rob asked. It was a fragment personality of your own. You were wishing for a playmate, and were jealous because your brother stayed so long with your father. Quite without knowing it, you materialized a personality fragment as a playmate. You had no way of knowing what had happened at the time, and could not give any permanence to the image. Occasionally, a personality will astound itself by such an image production. Usually, this type vanishes by the time the personality reaches adulthood. In childhood, however, such instances are frequent. Often, when a child cries about a bogeyman, what he has seen is such an image production of fibrous projection, formed by vivid desire on the part of the subconscious. I love the way he ties all this in with subconscious motivation, I said later. Rob grinned. Would you rather he didn't? But reincarnation, and kids forming fragment personalities or whatever as playmates? I frowned. Still, it's fascinating as the dickens. And think what it means if it's true. And think of the people we've known who suddenly seem entirely different than they used to be, in ways we can't fathom, Rob said. If Seth's right, they actually became the destructive images they had of themselves. I shivered uneasily. But it wouldn't always be destructive, would it? Couldn't it work the other way around? Worried? Rob asked. He was teasing me. Not at all, I said loftily, but I could see the faces of that couple in my mind still, and there were so many questions left up in the air. Some were answered in the following sessions, and this explanation from a session some 3 years later is particularly interesting. Now, as to the York Beach images. Here, aggressive and destructive energies were unconsciously projected outward, given a pseudo-reality and temporary physical validity. The emotional charge provides the pattern and impetus for such creations. According to the extent of physical reality to be achieved, the physical body of the originator transfers or transposes portions of its own chemical structure. Proteins are used, and there is a high carbohydrate loss. In the same way that the body's proteins and chemicals can be used to form various kinds of images, they may also be utilized to form an ulcer, goiter, or to effect other changes in the body itself. Here, particular emotions are denied, dissociated. The individual does not want to accept them as a part of the self. Instead of projecting them outward as you did in the York Beach images, they are directed to a specific area of the body, or in other cases, allowed to wander, traveling troublemakers, so to speak, through the body's physical system. By the time Seth gave us this information, we had the background to understand it. In his discussions on health, Seth has always maintained that illness is often the result of dissociated and inhibited emotions. The psyche attempts to get rid of them by projecting them into a specific area of the body. In the case of ulcers, the diverted energy goes into the actual production of the ulcer itself. If really large areas of the self are inhibited, a secondary personality can be formed, grouped about those qualities distrusted and denied by the primary ego, and usually opposed to it. In other instances, the inhibited emotions can be projected outward into other persons, or, as in the case of the York Beach images, very charged repressed energy can actually form pseudo-physical images which present the personality with the physically materialized image of his fears. Then, however, all of this was new to us. For all I knew, Seth was a secondary personality himself, and at this point we could have dropped the sessions. Though we found them intriguing, we certainly weren't convinced that Seth was someone who had survived death. Most likely, we thought, he was a very lively portion of my own subconscious. By now, we'd done enough reading to worry about the secondary personality angle. There was no evidence of excessive emotionalism in the material, though. No repressed hates, prejudices, or desires. Seth made no demands of any kind upon either of us. In the meantime, the Christmas holidays came along. We had no sessions for 2 weeks. Both of us wondered what would happen when and if we tried again. But the next episode so upset our ideas of what was possible, so outraged our conventional theories, that we very nearly quit the whole thing. Obviously, we didn't. Yet our reactions were to color our activities for the next several years, and greatly influence the direction in which I would allow my own psychic abilities to operate.